So in this lecture, we're going to talk about type anatomy and classification, and the construction of type, and also all the proper terminologies that go along with your letter forms. Um, Basically, the fonts are sized based upon 5 components. Um, and when we design fonts, we pay attention, or if we grid it out, we look at the baseline, which is where all of the letters sit or rest upon. There's a cap height, and that's the distance from the baseline. And also, based upon the size of the cap height, that determines the point size of the font that you're working with. And then lastly is the X height. That's this line through the middle where the main body or the lowercase letters go to. So for uppercase, they reach to the cap height, and for lowercase, they reach the tops of them reach the X heights. The other two things that we have in the type anatomy that are part of the main construction of the fonts are descenders and ascenders. A descender is like in the Y here, it's the little leg that goes below the baseline, and the ascender is the part of the lowercase letters that run above the X height. One thing that you should know is that the ascender doesn't always hit the top of the cap height. Sometimes they may be a little below or above. More likely than not, they're right at it, but also parts of them will go a little bit above it in some cases as well. So when we look at the different constructions of fonts that are depending upon their X heights and cap heights, etc., the same point fonts can look very different. So if you look at this, do I look fat in this paragraph, you can see that there are 4 different fonts, and they all have different sizings, even though they are all 32 point. So they have different X heights, they have different cap heights, and line weight, and of course they have the character width. The characters themselves are wider or smaller, and that can change a lot of the size differences within the fonts. So a 12-point font isn't always a 12-point font. Sometimes when you're writing a paper and you have it in Arial, it may run 3 pages, and then you change it to Times New Roman, and now, oh my gosh, I only have 2 pages. That can happen with the same point size for the font. Okay, and then down here you can also see how the X height might affect the different fonts and the looks of them. And this one has, if you see this, it also has an X height where the cap heights run, or I'm sorry, the ascenders run below the cap height for this font and that's on Miss Eves. The font's called Miss Eves. So that's kind of interesting. And you can also see how they look here in the bottom in a paragraph between Helvetica, which has a very tall X height, and Miss Eves, which has a very low X height. You can kind of see the caps, how the caps really stick up and create this empty negative space in this body copy, whereas Helvetica doesn't do that. So that's pretty interesting to know that those types of things you'll want to look at for each font depending upon the dynamics of how you may want to design body copy into your work down the road. We'll be working a lot with body copy in the 3rd module of the class. Not quite yet, but for now, just know that it's there in the font construction. So let's talk about the different terms. We've already covered cap height, X height, and baseline. The stem, you can already see that's just kind of the body or the structure of the font, the part that holds it up. The bowl is a enclosed space that's usually enclosed with a stem and a round. So you see that on the A here, and you can see that on the D down here. The serif is a little decorative element. For instance, we have two types of fonts that we talk about, which is a sans serif where they do not have these, and it's not there, and they have what's called terminals at the end. Um, and then, of course, we have serif fonts. And we also have different classifications of fonts based upon the types of serifs that we have. So it's kind of an interesting piece of terminology. The descender we talked about. The ligature is when you have two fonts that are, we should say, either create a lot of negative space or they're very tight with negative space. It's almost better to just combine them as one letter. So some fonts design ligatures in there that if you ever have an F and an L or an A and an E happen in succession, that it creates a single letter form that's a combination of those two, and that's what's known as the ligature, where those fonts combine. The finial is much like a terminal. We talked about the terminal being the end of a font without a serif. A finial is where the font terminates, but it goes from a thick to a thin. And of course, we talked about ascender, so we'll move down to the terminal. The terminals can have all sorts of decorative elements on them. Like in this case, this might be considered, if we made this a little larger, we might consider it a ball terminal. But it's just the end of a font. And the spine are typically just this part of the S. They're only in S's, so I probably won't ever ask you about these, but just know that that's there. The crossbar, and this is on A's, and this E has a crossbar. These have different line width dynamics in them too. Some of them are very uniform in their line width. Some of them move in like this, almost like we have with the serif, and that's just depending upon the font size. But this is called the crossbar. The counter is, of course, the inside of the font right here, inside the O. These are counters, and if you ever confuse the bowls and the counters, they're pretty much interchangeable. That term's pretty much interchangeable. I don't think anyone's going to ding you for saying that this is a bowl or a counter. But usually the bowls are the round that are connected with the stems, and the counters are just the enclosed. Or even the counters can be like in the H, it's not connected with the stem down here. It's this negative space inside the font. So this would be considered a counter too. So when we look at the type classifications, there's one more piece of type anatomy that I want to talk about that you didn't see in the earlier one, and it's called stress. And this is how we're going to tell the difference between these sans serif fonts here. So in this case, we have Sabin. This is a old style font. And what stress in a font is when you take these thicks and these thins, if you drew a line through the thin portions of the font, you can see that this would create a diagonal. And when we deal with old style fonts in a classification, they'll typically have a diagonal stress and they'll contain serifs. And that's what we call old style. Transitional, they are not quite as diagonal. They're almost vertical. And then when we get to, and then I probably won't be quizzing you too much on these, and it might be tough to discern between old style and transitional. You know, it's like, does it really need to be 50 degrees or a 40-degree break or a 10-degree break to finally move into a different classification? But we will tell the difference where it's a diagonal stress versus a vertical stress. If you look here, when it's vertical, these are what we call modern fonts. So modern fonts will still have the serifs, and in this case there's another term that we didn't quite mention, but these are bracketed serifs and unbracketed serifs. So you just want to know the difference between those, where they're very, very sharp serifs that are bracketed, and then of course the unbracketed where they're not. They kind of transition from the stem into the serif smoothly. Down here we have a slab serif. Notice these are these same thing. They're more bracketed than unbracketed, but they're very thick. So that's another classification of font we have, is a slab serif. And then, of course, down here we have the sans serif. To me, there's really no difference between the humanist sans serif to the geometric sans serif. To me, they're all kind of sans serif. But I guess when we talk about humanist, or at least what Lupton refers to as humanist in this, is when it looks like it was drawn with a calligraphy pen, where there's a dynamic between the thicks and the thins in the letter forms. So, so just so you know that distinction there. What's not up here are other couple types of classifications. One is a script, and that looks like it's completely handwritten. I would imagine most of you know what a script is. And another is what we call display, and those are like grungy, um, highly decorative fonts that you'd never put in body copy because it's so hard to read if you had a bunch of fonts inside of a large chunk of text. They're really more for headlines and to create kind of like a feel or some kind of emotion or some playfulness or uniqueness in the style of the font. But they're only for like that's why they call them display, because they're just like on these big displays, like signage displays and whatnot. So um, when we look at the fonts in a collection of fonts here, we can kind of see how some of them work in body copy. Some might be better than not. One of the questions that we always encounter, and this is important to know, and unless there's new research studies out there, which I don't think there are that would prove this, is that there isn't a font that is more um, efficient or useful than another. So if you had a bunch of readers read with Times New Roman and a bunch of readers read with Helvetica, there isn't a better case to use one over the other. When they did these studies, there was a significant difference between Helvetica being more serious, I think it was, or untruthful. I can't remember. It was one of the two that people thought that Helvetica was a little more deceiving or something than Times New Roman. And don't quote me on that, but realistically, as far as functionality is concerned, there isn't much of a difference. So all of these typefaces that you even see here work, and it's just kind of what kind of style contrasts with the topic or the feel or the visual feel that you want in your pieces. You know, I could write a book in any of these fonts that are here, and it would be fine. Of course, as a reader, I probably would prefer Sabin on the top, but I also like on screen. I do like Helvetica, and I love using as a designer. I love using Futura, especially for big bold signage. Even with the class, you'll notice I do use a lot of sans serif fonts, and the Futura is an awesome font, I think. So anyway, as we move on to the type family, so we've talked about the type anatomy, type classification. So now we're going to talk about families of fonts. What families of fonts are when you have one font. So if I had, say, Times New Roman, and I created variations of Times New Roman, these are families because they're all related with one another. So on the top we have these are all Adobe Garamond. On the top we have the regular, which may also be called Book or Roman, which is just the standard font or the way it is supposed to be in body copy. We have italics, and italics they're based upon cursive writing, but they're not script. And in fact, italic fonts are designed differently than the Roman font. If you look at the F in the italic is completely unique from the Roman. Most people think it's just tilted, a tilted font of the font, but it's not. That the tilted font is actually called oblique, and it is not an italic. Italics have their own distinct marks or different glyphs for the different letters. Small caps are basically just caps that are the same. Their cap height is the same as the X height on the font. Bold typefaces you see here, mostly used for emphasis. So if you were to say create a paragraph head, you might do it in bold, and then the body copy would be regular. Or if you want to emphasize one word within the text, you might use something like bold. They also have the italic, bold, italic, and the expert sets also have lining and non-lining numbers. One that would reach to the cap height, and another set of numbers that would reach to the X height. So those are some of the different families, or the main families that should be included with almost every font if you made a serious font. So the type crimes that they mention in here, you can see these type crimes. One is slanting, that's creating oblique fonts. Another's inflating. So instead of creating your own unique bold typeface set with good spacing, inflating is just putting an outline on the fonts, and what you see what happens is it really shortens up the space, and it also kind of looks a little bit dull compared to this. This just looks richer than this. And then of course there's the shrinking the letters. So this is when you take the cap height and bring it down instead of developing a new font. What happens is you don't just shrink the size, you also shrink the width. So when you do that, when you shrink the width of the strokes of the font, it creates these kind of like puny fonts. And these are, they call them type crimes. And I don't know if they're really crimes. You won't get in trouble for it, but it's, you know, it's probably better to you don't want to try to fake it. This would be faking it. I guess to the normal person, no one would even know. But if we talk about these really large type families, you can kind of see, and you'll get some of these when we deal with the Adobe fonts and the Adobe Folio. There's some fonts that have all of these different parts of their family, and this is good because in one piece you don't really want to go outside of font families too much when designing one piece. You want to tie in the fonts together. In fact, one of the unhidden rules that we have in typography is that you should never use more than 3 fonts in one piece. And even I think 3 is too many. So if you want a difference in the fonts, then a good thing to do is to create font families that are consistent with one another. You know, they don't look that different, so it doesn't look like you're choosing all these different styles that are all over the place. It will keep your work more consistent and integrated when you do something like this. So and you can kind of go through the list here. We see all these different ones, and they all are designed a little different, but they all look similar, which is nice. So they can be used in different circumstances on your or in your design.